Yang reporting live from Beijing. The reform of labor camp system, among other things, tops the agenda of the new CPC leadership. The release of Ren Jianyu in Chongqing may have helped ease the public anger about depriving him of his individual right to speak out. But detention without open trial has become the hallmark of a flawed legal system here. What can be done to carry out the rule of law? And how difficult is it to abolish the labor re-education system? Today, we are pleased to be joined here by Professor He Jiahong, Madame Lu Yu, and Mr. Edward Lehman. But before we get started, let's look at this.
Complaining on the internet could land people in jail without trial. Ren Jianyu, a former village official in Chongqing, was detained in 2011. Police said the 25-year-old forwarded and commented on more than 100 pieces of what they call negative information. A month later, without trial, he was sentenced to 2 years of re-education through labor for incitement to subvert state power. After he was freed last November, he immediately sued the Chongqing municipal government. His lawyer says the system is unconstitutional.
The Constitution says a citizen can't be arrested without the approval of court. The re-education through labor system allows police to detain people for up to 2 years without an open trial.
And the government is working to change it. The Political and Legal Work Conference says China will push forward reforms on the re-education through labor system no later than this year. Xi Jinping, leader of the ruling Communist Party of China, has vowed to build a peaceful China, which is governed by law. He called for a fight against injustice and corruption to ensure justice in each judicial case. The meeting points out, if China is to maintain political integrity, social justice and stability, the root lies in the rule of law. Otherwise, we will not only fail to solve the problems at the root, but it will also lead to more conflicts. According to the Ministry of Justice, by the end of 2008, 160,000 people were held in labor centers nationwide. Some people say the reform is a long-awaited result, won by thousands of people like Ren Jianyu, who never stopped fighting for change. But in our exclusive interview, he dismissed the comment with a shrug.
I don't know why the media always want to portray me as a hero. I'm just defending my own rights. If anyone defending his own rights can be a hero, it's a tragedy of society.
Just recently, Ren Jianyu lost his case in the final appeal. The Chongqing court says the local government acted legitimately to put him under re-education through labor for inciting to subvert state power. Now, with a major signal of reform just sent, critics say that as China builds up a society based on the rule of law, it is important that it should have certain rules to prevent people from being imprisoned without trial just for speaking their minds. Han Peng, CCTV, Beijing.
Welcome back. We are pleased to be joined here by Professor He Jiahong, Madame Lu, and Edward Lehman. I don't think these three share the same consensus and hold the same opinion. Let's start from Professor He Jiahong. A relic of the 1950s, what do you think of the possible abolition of the notorious labor system? I mean, the re-education through labor system.
My opinion is that this system of re-education through labor will be abolished sooner or later. I hope it will be abolished soon. We have to see that the legal basis for this system has problems. I would not like to say this is unconstitutional, but there is a conflict between this system and the basic principles of our Constitution. We all know that one basic principle of Constitution is respect and protect human rights. And also some article in our Constitution provided clearly, to arrest a person must get the approval either from the People's Procuratorate or from the People's Court. And there is another conflict between this system of legislative law, that. Article 8 of a legislative law provided, any coercive measures or punishment depriving personal freedom shall be provided by statutes only. And this is administrative regulation. It cannot do that.
Proceeding from the logic that we have to get protection from the Constitution about personal freedom. No coercive means whatsoever should be applied to restrict personal freedom. I mean, that should absolutely serve as a precondition for any interpretations about the law and about the labor re-education system. What do you think of the possible abolition, or do you oppose any thorough and complete abolition of the labor re-education system?
Well, I think it's completely out of date. If you look at the date was enacted in 1950s, and the situation today is very different. And from the legal system, I think from 1950s until now, we really have a huge development. There are many laws has been issued, and also the criminal law had been advised many times. And as a matter of fact, this labor camp or this labor re-education system has been abused in reality, not just talking about it's not in accordance with the Constitution. So it should be abolished completely.
It should be phased out completely, right?
I believe
I'd
so.
like to have views from Edward Lehman, no resist lawyer.
Yeah, hello, Young Ray. How are you? It's difficult from a pragmatic standpoint. I mean, I understand what the professor is saying. Article 37 of the Constitution says that no one can be arrested and their rights can't be taken away from them unless they have a court hearing. But as a practical matter, this was set up in 1957 during the Great Leap Forward, and we didn't have a lot of lawyers back then, and the public security organs were attempting to have public order, and I understand the reasoning behind this system. And I suppose what they're saying is that technically these people are not arrested. They can be detained for up to 2 years, but they cannot be arrested. In the United States, we have the 4th Amendment, we have the 14th Amendment on due process. We have the right of habeas corpus, which says if some custodian, like the Public Security Bureau or some organ, a police department in the United States, arrests somebody, we can actually bring that matter to court and say, why are you having this person in custody? We don't have those sort of recourses here in China, and I understand where it's impractical. But at the other hand, we have a system where we don't have enough lawyers, we don't have enough of a judiciary yet to probably deal with all of these matters as well. So it's a practical system. I think it should be eventually phased out, but I think it serves a purpose for managing 1.3 billion people.
Jiahong.
I think, yes, we have to, going back to the historical development of this system. In 1957, the State Council made the decision to establish this system and got the approval from the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. But at the time, the basic purpose for that was for a political campaign. We all know that in 1957, it was fighting so-called rightist campaign. You know, among the first persons to be sent to the camp, the majority was the rightists, and the serious rightists was sent to prison. And I think if the number is correct in my memory, there were more than 400,000 minor rightists were sent to the camps.
Most of them were intellectuals who were wrongly labeled as anti-revolutionaries.
Right. And then during
it's
the
a purge from the within.
Right.
From within.
So I say that's a kind of byproduct of a political campaign, and it's a product of a mentality of class struggle and military struggle. And then you know that during the Cultural Revolution, it was not used very often. But in 1979, the State Council made another decision to give a time limit. You know, before that, there was no time limit. Then some of them were staying in the camp for more than 20 years. So in 1979, they said, generally speaking, it will be put into the camp for just 1 year to 3 years, and in special situation can be prolonged to 4 years. But then in 1980s, 1990s, I think it served a kind of proper purpose for keeping social order, because they added that the petty offenders, like you know the petty thieves and you know the hooligans and you know the prostitutes or prostitute visitors, and then later the drug users, they put them to the camp, try to re-educate them through labor. However, you know, I think that in the new century, there was a big change in our society, especially the conflict between the common people and the public officials getting deeper and deeper. So the system, the original...
Your argument, please, Professor He. Do you think the labor camp system does have its own legitimate reason to exist? It should go through some kind of reform, but it has the legitimacy to exist.
Yes, I think especially in 1980s, 1990s, it played a role, There is a gap between the criminal law.
Excuse me, you're saying that, Professor, you may have ignored another area where abuse is most likely to occur. For example, the very reason for the labor camp to be set up is that the local governments could easily make their decisions to punish those who who perpetrated their not exactly crimes, but made mistakes outside the strict legal system, outside the legal punishment, and therefore they could be sent to a labor camp.
I agree
Any incomplete reform might still, leave some margins for the maneuvers, whimsical maneuvers of the local government. Luca, what's your take about the vulnerability of having an incomplete reform about this notorious labor system?
Exactly. I think the labor camp is kind of byproduct of political issues back in 1950s. It's no longer there anymore. And if you continue the system, even though we give another name, and a more pretty name, it's still a loophole in the law, and people can abuse it. I think the majority issue regarding labor camp is that it was abused. The powers were abused in reality. I think that's the biggest issue we are facing. It's not, there's no specific details about the law, how to use it, how to implement it. It's just give the power to the people to interpret it and just throw people into prison or into the labor camp, which is in reality kind of prison.
Given the poor reputation
I think that,
of law enforcement forces in our country, the lack of oversight in particular will definitely lead to abuse of the what we call correction and education of violation system.
On this point, I agree with you. That the big problem for this system is that absolutely relied on the personality of the public officials. So if the public officials were good persons, were noble persons, it was going well because it kind of separation of power. The committee of the education through labor were composed of the officers from the Public Security Department and the Civil Affairs Department and the Labor Department, and also the facilities were run by the Ministry of Justice. And there is a review procedure by special agency within the Public Security Department. But now the problem is most of the public officials are not good persons. They are not noble persons.
So we have to define who is a good person.
If it is not, so we have to make a better system. Well, I think it's not just to change the name of the law. We have to have a more transparent decision-making proceeding, and also we have to have the judicial review, to guarantee that...
So you do understand the rule of the game, that we have to bet the protection of individual freedom on institutions instead of on being a good man. I mean, that's pretty vulnerable and risky.
Yeah, exactly. I think when we talk about rule of law, we cannot rely on the personality. We cannot rely on personal interpretation. We cannot even leave room to people. They can freely interpret the law and use their own power to do whatever they want. I think when we talk about rule of law, we have to really eliminate all these loopholes.
Yes, that's right.
The other point I have to mention is that you must minimize the degree of, the kind of coercive application of any regulations or rules because of the poor oversight. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think when we talk about a lot of the issues, in reality, a lot of issues actually because we don't have a specific guidelines, so people interpret themselves. If you look at whole China, maybe in certain region it's much better, in certain region it's worse because there's no standard rules. I think we have to rely on a system. We cannot rely that we have a general law, we have a principle, and it's up to the police officer to interpret it.
Well, when an assembly, a kind of assembly has been set up to oversee the behavior of the Center for Education and the Correction of the Violations. That reminds me of what happened back in 1988 when the first draft organic law of a village election was passed by the Standing Committee of the NPC, our top legislature. It said at the same time that the village's assembly should be set up to oversee the conduct of the village head. Now, if the village head has violated the family planning policy, the village's assembly could impeach the village head. But ever since the approval of the first organic law about the rural election, few of the village heads have ever been impeached. Now, that says a lot about the legal awareness or litigate-mindedness of the population at large in this particular vulnerable area. But we'll come back to examine these and other vulnerabilities. Stay with us.
I wholeheartedly support the central government's decision to reform the re-education through labor system. The move will effectively balance the power of law enforcement personnel so that justice can prevail in our society.
I think the re-education through labor system works as long as it is well regulated. You can't process every case through the legal system because it takes too long and wastes too much money.
Anything can be achieved with the people's participation.
The re-education through labor system has contributed a lot to our society. It's a good way to manage and educate those who have done minor damage to our society and can't be controlled by their own families.
The re-education through labor system seriously violates human rights. It should have been abolished a long time ago.
The crime of hooliganism has been abolished. Now even the re-education through labor system will be reformed. Watch out, the demon has been unleashed.
We have every reason to believe that reforms will be carried on in all areas of Chinese society. China will have a better tomorrow.
Welcome back. My first question goes to Edward. Now, for decades, the covering range of re-education through labor kept expanding, as Professor He said in the first paragraph, in the first part of the program, eventually covering more than 20 seconds of misdeeds with the passage of time. Some of them are based on moral judgments, such as cohabitation outside legal marriages. Some charges are no longer applicable today, such as reselling for profits the daily supply coupons in the era of a planned economy. Now, if you look at these petty offenses, what do you think of the weaknesses, if not the areas of ambiguous interpretations for application of the law between criminal law and public security administration punishment?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the key issue. What's considered a petty offense and what's considered actually a criminal offense. The criminal offense would be handled by the criminal law and should then go through the system. If you face incarceration for more than 6 months, up to 15 years, you're entitled to a hearing on that matter and a criminal matter. And so this is a Public Security Bureau interpretation of what's considered a petty offense. It reminds me a lot of my constitutional law professor. He said that he had a relationship with his wife, and he said that my wife makes all of the petty decisions and I make all of the important decisions. It's only that she makes the decision what's petty and what's important. And so it's the same issue that we have here, which is what is considered a petty offense. If using drugs and then withdrawing from drugs and then using them again, is that enough to get 2 years imprisonment by the Public Security Bureau? According to the regulations, it is. And you know, there are some positive sides to this too. There are young people who actually won't have a criminal record, will have done something that would not conform with the norms of society, but it would, you know, we have such things like drunk driving where we have community service. We have such things as public intoxication where you do community service. And so there are things like this that are instituted, not as severe. I think what shocks the public are these very strange and very crazy cases that really gets their attention and says, well, wait a minute, we have to completely rethink and completely abolish the system. I think we have to balance it. I think that there's a balance between the pragmatics of instituting these kind of behaviors. In the past, in the 80s, when I would visit the jails, I would say, what are people in for? And they would say hooliganism. And I couldn't understand what that was all about. Now I understand under Public Security Bureau investigation that that's one of the reasons why you can be put into a detention center. But so I think we need to tighten up what exactly is considered to be a petty offense, and what and some of these abuses we've seen in very famous cases are the ones that have brought this to the attention
And
of
you
people.
know, during the Cultural Revolution, and even in the early years after the end of the Cultural Revolution, marriage of the same sex was considered hooliganism in some parts of China. Therefore, those victims were subject to not only administrative punishment, but perhaps victims of legal punishment. Thank you.
And also, I would just add up one thing. You know, during that period of time, any kind of sexual relationship out of marriage would be considered as a hooliganism. You know, even that relationship between the lovers. You know. So that's ridiculous. So the society has changed a lot. I agree with Edwards, you know, that who made the decision, who have the right to interpret what is the petty offenders. And also there is another big loophole in that system. You know, sometimes they will say this guy is hindering, you know, the enforcement of the law, and also damages the social order or social stability. So this is very dangerous, you know, for people. Sometimes, you know, people just had, I wouldn't use the word dissident, but they may have different opinions with the local leaders and criticize the leaders. And the leaders will use the public security department and use this labor camp to lock them up. And I think that's very dangerous.
In fact, Ren Jianyu, the young man who was supposed to be the village head after graduation, was very close to being called a dissident, because he criticized those who deprive individuals of their personal freedom of speech. Simply because he posted a message on Weibo denouncing, you know, such kind of misbehavior. Let's look at say, the opposition from local government as to a complete abolition of the labor re-education system. Luca, what do you think of, say, the reluctance of the local government?
I think definitely, you know, for them it's a power, right? If they can interpret things very easily and in their favor, of course, they will be very reluctant to give the power away. And coming back to the issues you just discussed, I also like to mention that we also need to draw a line what is a criminal offense and what is a morality issue. That the criminal law shouldn't really govern the morality issue. Morality is wrong, but is it criminal offense? Like what you mentioned, the sex issue. I think we should really draw a line. If we don't draw a line, it's very easily to be interpreted by the local government people side. We believe this is, you know, a petty criminal offense.
The whole national debate as to whether the labor re-education system should be abolished was triggered actually by the petition of a mother, Tang Hui, whose daughter was abducted and coercively asked to be a prostitute. And when she came to complain, she was taken back rudely and put into a re-education camp. This triggered and ignited a national debate about the brutality of the re-education labor. Now, petitioners have captured the headlines these days, and particularly those petitioners who were intercepted and taken back coercively and eventually ended up being put under the house arrest to be more lenient. But in most cases, they are sentenced to the labor re-education. What do you think of the phenomenon of a petition in China?
I think this is a social problem.
A social problem?
Yes, especially for the public officials in all levels. But the causes for them is very complicated. You know, some of the petitioners were asking help to higher authority, you know, for injustice decision by the court, or some may relating to, you know, the land development and something else. But I think those cases illustrate a very bad part of the system of the re-education through labor, because I think for many offenders it's not a very big problem, because we have somehow clear line between the criminal acts and the non-criminal acts. That's a general illegal acts. But the line between the criticism of a government or dissidents or something would be considered as a troublemaker for social order or social stability, the line is not clear. And the local public officials, the public security department may have the burden, may have the duty to keep the social order. And they may use it without a transparent decision-making process, without effective judicial review. That's very dangerous.
Last week we did a similar show about the abolition of a re-education system. Luca and Victor Gao said, why don't we learn from the Western legal institutions by employing a lawyer? Now, you are a lawyer. What's wrong with the army of lawyers in China? Is that because of the small number of the lawyers, or is that a matter of expenses? Because the ordinary people don't have the financial means to employ a lawyer. But Pu Zhiqiang, a lawyer, stepped out to help Ren Jianyu. I don't think Ren Jianyu has the money to employ a famous lawyer like Pu Zhiqiang. What kind of suggestions would you have?
I think the issue is that, from number perspective, we do have actually a large number of lawyers. From expenses perspective, actually, we can do a lot of legal aid. It's a kind of also task from the law society that we do legal aid. And I don't think it's a matter of charge. I think the issue is the system. For example, in the labor camp system, before the person is sent to the labor camp, there's no way they can involve lawyers.
However, I have to clarify one thing. In 2005, there was a calling for abolish this system. So the Ministry of Public Security made a decision to allow lawyers to be involved in the process of deciding someone to be sent to the camp. But in practice, there were not many lawyers involved. I think that's just like you mentioned. Not many lawyers would like to be involved in this process. And in fact, not many lawyers would like to take the criminal cases. That's a big problem in China, right?
Let's look at the consequences arising from the tragedy of Li Zhuang, who was detained sort of illegally by Wang Lijun, former public security bureau chief of Chongqing municipality. Now, as a result of his tragic occurrence, the rate of criminal defense dropped sharply because lawyers were very reluctant to defend ambiguous and dangerous cases like, the victim that Li Zhuang helped defend. What do you think of the mentality of lawyers?
Well, the thing is that I think sometimes, as you mentioned, even though they may have some kind of law, but in reality it's very much neglected. And the issue is that there's no clear procedure. So even though you say, oh, I'm sorry, the law say lawyer can be involved, and they say, sorry, because it's not the court, you don't really give them time to go and see them.
Thank
if
you
they
very
like
much.
you, they see you. If they don't like you, they don't see you.
Thank you very much, Edward, Luca, and Professor He Jiahong, for your participation in this enlightening discussion about whether there should be an immediate abolition of the labor re-education system, a notorious hallmark of the authoritarian institutions in this country, and the legacy of the former Soviet Union. I will see you next time. Bye for now.
More than 100 pieces of what they call negative information. A month later, without trial, he was sentenced to 2 years of re-education through labor for incitement to subvert state power. After he was freed last November, he immediately sued the Chongqing municipal government. His lawyer says the system is unconstitutional.
The Constitution says a citizen can't be arrested without the approval of court. The re-education through labor system allows police to detain people for up to 2 years without an open trial.
And the government is working to change it. The Political and Legal Work Conference says China will push forward reforms on the re-education through labor system no later than this year. Xi Jinping, leader of the ruling Communist Party of China, has vowed to build a peaceful China, which is governed by law. He called for a fight against injustice and corruption to ensure justice in each judicial case.
Hello, I'm Yang Rui, reporting live from Beijing. The reform of the labor camp system, among other things, tops the agenda of the new CPC leadership. The release of Ren Jianyu in Chongqing may have helped ease the public anger about depriving him of his individual right to speak out. But detention without open trial has become the hallmark of a flawed legal system here. What can be done to carry out the rule of law? And how difficult is it to abolish the labor re-education system? Today, we are pleased to be joined here by Professor He Jiahong, Madame Lu Yu, and Mr. Edward Lehman. But before we get started, let's look at this.
Complaining on the internet could land people in jail without trial. Ren Jianyu, a former village official in Chongqing, was detained in 2011. Police said the 25-year-old forwarded and commented on. The meeting points out, if China is to maintain political integrity, social justice and stability, the root lies in the rule of law. Otherwise, we will not only fail to solve the problems at the root, but it will also lead to more conflicts. According to the Ministry of Justice, by the end of 2008, 160,000 people were held in labor centers nationwide. Some people say the reform is a long-awaited result, won by thousands of people like Ren Jianyu, who never stopped fighting for change. But in our exclusive interview, he dismissed the comment with a shrug.
I don't know why the media always want to portray me as a hero. I'm just defending my own rights. If anyone defending his own rights can be a hero, it's a tragedy of society.
Just recently, Ren Jianyu lost his case in the final appeal. The Chongqing court says the local government acted
abolished sooner or later. I hope it will be abolished soon. We have to see that the legal basis for this system has problems. I would not like to say this is unconstitutional, but there is a conflict between this system and the basic principles of our Constitution. We all know that one basic principle of Constitution is respect and protect human rights. And also some article in our Constitution provided clearly, to arrest a person must get the approval either from the People's Procuratorate or from the People's Court. And there is another conflict between this system of legislative law, that. Article 8 of a legislative law provided, any coercive measures or punishment depriving personal freedom shall be provided by statutes only.
Legitimately to put him under re-education through labor for inciting to subvert state power. Now with a major signal of reform just sent, critics say that as China builds up a society based on the rule of law, it is important that it should have certain rules to prevent people from being imprisoned without trial just for speaking their minds. Han Peng, CCTV, Beijing.
Welcome back. We are pleased to be joined here by Professor He Jiahong, Madame Lu, and Edward Lehman. I don't think these three share the same consensus and hold the same opinion. Let's start from Professor He Jiahong. A relic of the 1950s, what do you think of the possible abolition of the notorious labor system? I mean, the re-education through labor system.
My opinion is that this system of re-education through labor will be abolished.